Some Canadian snowbirds are packing up and saying goodbye to their U.S. homes for good.
Canadians are our number one foreign visitor group. They bring a lot of money here. And yeah, we're noticing it, we're feeling it.
As the snow begins to melt and the days get longer, many Canadians wintering in the U.S. are making plans to come home.
Definitely have we had a big drop in Canadian visitors, and I've actually called several of them that used to come every year and spend a lot of money on these beachfront rentals. They're saying, sorry buddy, we're out for the foreseeable future.
Florida has always sold itself as the land of sunshine, cheap flights, and warm winters. For decades, it was more than just a vacation spot. It was a second home for millions of Canadians fleeing snow, ice, and bitter January winds.
Canadians are making a mass exodus, and now businesses on our Gulf Coast saying they are feeling the impact. I don't know if it's the hurricane, the economy, a mix of the two, but we've definitely been, everybody around here that I spoke to has been down about 30% this year.
The summer swing never happened for us either.
These seasonal residents weren't ordinary tourists. They didn't just come for a week and leave. They bought condos, paid property taxes, stayed for 6 months at a time, and poured billions into local economies. For small towns along the Gulf Coast or retirement communities in South Florida, Canadians weren't just visitors, they were the backbone of the entire winter economy. But in 2025, something unthinkable happened.
Boycotting paradise because of politics, Floridians are now seeing less Canadians flock to the Sunshine State.
The people Florida politicians assumed would never leave began walking away in huge numbers. It started with small warning signs. Fewer bookings in December, a noticeable dip in January rentals, more for sale signs popping up in neighborhoods long dominated by Ontario and Quebec plates. Then came the phone calls to tourism boards. Executives who had weathered recessions, hurricanes, even a pandemic, suddenly admitted they were facing something worse than all of that combined. They had lost their most reliable customer base, and this time it wasn't coming back. At the center of it all was politics. Florida's leadership, caught up in the culture wars and eager to prove toughness, pushed hostile policies and rhetoric aimed directly at foreign seasonal residents. And hovering over the whole crisis was the influence of Donald Trump, whose repeated comments about Canada being America's 51st state poured gasoline on an already burning fire. For Canadians, the message was clear. They weren't guests anymore, they were targets. The numbers tell the story better than anything else. In just 6 months, Florida lost over $6 billion in direct Canadian spending. These weren't speculative estimates. These were empty restaurants, shuttered shops, and canceled contracts. Property tax revenue from Canadian-owned homes collapsed. Contractors who specialized in maintaining those winter homes watched business evaporate. Local hospitals and dental clinics, which had counted on seasonal patients planning their checkups during Florida stays, reported revenue losses as high as 60%. Airlines cut routes. Car rental agencies parked unused vehicles in empty lots. For politicians in Tallahassee, this wasn't supposed to happen. They assumed Canadians needed Florida more than Florida needed Canadians. After all, the beaches were still here, the theme parks still running, the palm trees still swaying. But what they underestimated was the global competition. Sunshine exists in more places than just Miami. Mexico saw the exodus and streamlined visa rules to attract retirees. Portugal and Spain launched campaigns inviting Canadians to try out winters on the Mediterranean. Caribbean islands doubled down on marketing themselves as safe, stable, and welcoming. Once Canadians realized they had choices, Florida stopped looking special. Behind the scenes, tourism officials begged politicians to dial it back. They presented reports showing 30% drops in bookings, nearly 40% cuts in airline reservations, and massive declines in property searches by Canadians. These weren't abstract warnings, they were real-time data. But instead of reversing course, politicians doubled down. They treated it like a show of strength. They said if foreigners couldn't handle tough talk, maybe they shouldn't come at all. It played well on television, but it set entire communities up for disaster. For Canadians, this wasn't just about economics. It was about respect. They had spent decades pouring money into Florida, supporting local businesses, and treating those towns as their own. Many of them had lifelong friendships with American neighbors, yet suddenly they were being painted as outsiders, freeloaders, or even threats. On top of that came new requirements: background checks, fingerprinting for extended stays, more restrictions on property purchases by foreign nationals. For retirees who just wanted to spend winters away from snow, it was insult stacked on inconvenience. By February, the exodus was undeniable. Canadians weren't just skipping a season, they were selling. Entire condo complexes where French-Canadian snowbirds once dominated became flooded with listings. Real estate agents admitted their inventories had tripled, but buyers had vanished. Prices collapsed by 30% in some regions. Commercial landlords followed the same path. Restaurants and strip malls dependent on seasonal crowds defaulted on leases. Regional airports designed around charter flights from Toronto or Montreal cut capacity by nearly half. What had taken decades to build was disintegrating in months. And then there's the math. Canadian seasonal residents spend an average of $30,000 to $35,000 per household over the course of a winter. That includes restaurants, repairs, medical care, shopping, entertainment, the whole ecosystem. Replace that with a one-week American vacationer spending $1,200 and you see the problem instantly. It takes 28 American families to equal one Canadian snowbird household. And those families don't exist in the numbers needed. They don't stay long enough. They don't buy property. They don't sustain off-season employment. The loss simply can't be replaced. What made this collapse so striking was the speed. This wasn't like gradual economic decline or a slow shift in demographics. This was a cliff. Politicians who insisted nothing was wrong in January were watching empty hotel rooms and dark storefronts by March. Yet public statements never changed. They blamed exchange rates, global markets, anything except their own decisions. Privately, internal memos leaked to the press showed panic. Tourism boards wrote desperate letters warning of long-term collapse. Local mayors called emergency meetings, begging the state to change course. But the political machine in Tallahassee stayed locked in, convinced that admitting mistakes would be worse than watching billions evaporate. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canadians were furious. Editorials blasted Florida for arrogance. Talk radio callers said they'd never spend another dime in the United States. Families who had spent decades wintering in Sarasota or Fort Lauderdale were now buying condos in Portugal or heading to Mexico's Riviera Maya. Social media was filled with posts of Canadians happily showing off new properties abroad with captions like, "Better beaches, better neighbors." It wasn't just about weather anymore, it was about dignity. And then there was Donald Trump. The former president, still wielding influence, had spent years mocking Canada, hinting at annexation, and treating the relationship like a joke. When he suggested making Canada the 51st state, what he saw as a clever line landed like an insult across the border. Combine that with trade wars, tariff threats, and constant political hostility, and the Canadian public mood hardened. Even Canadians who once loved Florida decided they had better options elsewhere. The impact is staggering. Florida's tourism infrastructure, airports, rental fleets, medical centers, was built on the assumption that Canadians would always come. Now those investments are stranded assets. Communities that lived off snowbird dollars for decades face collapse. Municipal budgets dependent on property taxes from seasonal residents are suddenly underwater. Debt still has to be paid, roads still have to be maintained, police and fire services still need funding. But the economic activity to support all of that is disappearing. The global ripple effects are just beginning. International investors are studying Florida as a cautionary tale. They see a state so caught up in short-term political theatrics that it destroyed its own long-term economic model. Tourism boards from Europe to the Caribbean are learning the opposite lesson. Welcome foreign guests, respect their contributions, and build policies around partnership rather than hostility. Every one of Florida's competitors is capitalizing on its mistakes. And here's the most important part. Once a relationship like this is broken, it doesn't snap back. Canadians who sell their Florida properties and establish new lives abroad aren't coming back just because the rhetoric softens later. Trust takes years to rebuild, and in the meantime, Mexico, Spain, and the Caribbean will solidify their positions as the new winter havens. Florida may never recover its old dominance. The irony is brutal. Florida politicians thought they were defending American pride. Instead, they destroyed American prosperity. They thought Canadians needed Florida more than Florida needed Canadians. Instead, Canadians proved they had choices, and they took their money, their property investments, and their loyalty elsewhere. The Sunshine State is now learning that sunshine alone isn't enough to keep an economy alive. The story is simple but devastating. A combination of arrogance, nationalism, and sheer political short-sightedness nuked one of Florida's greatest economic advantages. And the fallout will be felt not just in empty condos and closed restaurants, but in the global perception of America as a whole. If one state can casually destroy billions of dollars in economic activity through rhetoric alone, what does that say about the stability of the entire country? For now, Canadians are gone, Florida is bleeding, and competitors around the world are celebrating. The state that once branded itself as paradise has turned into a cautionary tale. When politics trumps economics, everyone loses. And in this case, the losers are entire communities built on trust, friendship, and decades of cross-border cooperation. What Florida's leaders don't seem to understand is that the damage isn't temporary. This is structural. The Canadian snowbird migration that sustained Florida for half a century has been diverted, maybe permanently, to destinations that show respect. Sunshine and beaches are easy to find. What's rare is stability, security, and a government that values foreign guests instead of demonizing them. Canadians have realized that, and Florida is paying the price.